Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are tackling a genuinely wild and honestly pretty jarring economic puzzle. Right now, we're witnessing this massive head-on collision between some incredibly positive, headline-grabbing domestic data on one hand and the impending reality of a severe global crisis on the other. It's essentially a story of economic resilience abruptly crashing right into geopolitical reality. And honestly, understanding how these two massive forces interact is absolutely crucial if we want to grasp where the economy is actually heading.
So let's dive right into this split-screen reality we find ourselves in. On one side, we have the economy we thought we had. The UK recently delivered some fantastic growth numbers, literally the kind of data that makes any finance minister's day. We were actually looking at the fastest growth in the entire G7. But looming on the other side of that screen is the crisis that's coming. A war playing out thousands of miles away is threatening to completely shatter that progress and bring the entire economic recovery to a screeching halt. Today, we're going to break down both sides of this equation to understand exactly what's at stake here.
Section 1. The Q2 Growth Illusion and how the UK topped the G7.
To really understand the wave of optimism that was washing over the markets just a little while ago, we have to look at a very specific, very positive number, 0.4%. That was the UK's economic growth in the second quarter between April and June. And this wasn't just some one-off statistical fluke. It followed a really stellar 0.6% growth in the first quarter and a surprising 0.3% expansion in June alone. On paper, these numbers put the UK economy firmly ahead of heavy hitters like the US, Germany, and Japan in the IMF's July outlook.
Now, what's really interesting is digging into exactly what fueled this G7 leading growth. It really came down to three primary drivers. First off, we saw a massive boom in the services sector, which, remember, makes up about 80% of the UK economy. It grew by 0.5%, heavily driven by hospitality and entertainment. Think about it. The World Cup brought fans flooding into pubs, and some unusually hot weather sent people out shopping and dining. Second, business investment jumped nearly 2%. Companies are finally feeling confident enough to spend on new tech, equipment, and expansion. And finally, there was just a bit of statistical luck. By narrowly avoiding a technical recession last year, the economy managed to carry some crucial momentum right into this year.
Even the most cautious experts were getting on board with this narrative. As one economist perfectly captured it, the Q2 numbers were genuinely solid, showing an economy that had absorbed the shock of higher interest rates and was still moving forward. They noted the UK really deserved credit for that. The optimism was palpable. But every single one of those sunny, optimistic forecasts came with a little footnote. And unfortunately for the global economy, that tiny footnote has abruptly become the main story.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Strait of Hormuz shock, the global choke point.
You see, this isn't just a story about geopolitics. It's fundamentally a story about supply chain mechanics. The Strait of Hormuz is a super narrow stretch of water between Iran and Oman. It's arguably the single most important maritime transit route in the world because it handles roughly 20% of the globe's oil supply. With the conflict with Iran escalating, this strait is effectively acting as a closed door. Oil tankers literally aren't sailing through. Insurers are completely fleeing the route, flat out refusing to cover vessels. And as a direct result of this massive bottleneck, global oil prices have violently surged right past $100 a barrel.
And this brilliantly, if somewhat painfully, illustrates why the IMF explicitly named Britain as the most vulnerable G7 economy to this specific type of energy shock. The structural weaknesses are just glaring. The UK imports far more of its energy than peers like the US, Germany, or France. Unlike the US, it doesn't have vast domestic shale reserves to fall back on. On top of that, the country's energy storage capacity is severely limited. Add in the fact that the power grid relies heavily on gas-fired plants, and you have an economy that is entirely exposed to the wild swings in wholesale global energy prices. So what does a global oil shock actually mean for the everyday economy?
Section 3. The Inflation Rebound. The Return of the Cost of Living Crisis.
So the crucial point here is understanding how an international conflict happening thousands of miles away directly hits local businesses. It operates through this vicious four-step domino effect. Step 1. The war drives up global energy prices. Step 2. Because energy is required for literally everything, transport, manufacturing, food production, those energy prices drive up broader inflation. Step 3. As everyday goods become way more expensive, consumers are forced to make spending cuts. They stop going to the pubs and shops that drove all that great Q2 growth. And finally, Step 4. Those widespread spending cuts eventually drive the whole economy right into a recession.
The immediate financial punch to households is pretty staggering. We'd all hoped headline inflation was finally settling down to around that 2% target, but energy bills have already jumped 13%, pushing the average annual bill to over £1,800. And with this current crisis, analysts project this could easily push past £2,100.
Because of this exact dynamic, Treasury models are now flashing warning signs that inflation could spike aggressively back up to 4.3%. The Bank of England's adverse scenarios even model it hitting as high as 4.5% by the end of the year.
Section 4. The policy trap. The Bank of England's no-win scenario.
All of this builds into a completely impossible choice for the central bank. Think about it. Before this war, they were preparing to cut interest rates to give borrowers some much-needed relief. Now, if they raise rates to fight off this new inflation, they risk completely crushing our teetering Q2 growth and triggering a recession. But on the flip side, if they hold rates steady to try and save that growth, they risk letting inflation run hot, which severely erodes real wages and eats away at the wealth of savers. There's honestly no good option here. They are trapped looking for the least bad option.
Adding immense pressure to this economic dilemma is, of course, the political reality. With the general election approaching, the government is naturally under intense pressure to step in and deliver solutions, whether that's in the form of tax cuts or spending packages to help struggling households. But the math simply isn't cooperating. Because borrowing costs are rising and the broader economy is facing a slowdown, the actual fiscal room the government has to step in and offer that relief is shrinking by the day.
Section 5. The storm ahead. Rewriting the 2026 and 2027 forecasts.
When we contrast the pre-war forecasts with the post-war reality, the figures are just incredibly stark. GDP growth for 2027 was originally projected to be a healthy 1.6%, but under a 6-month disruption scenario, that plunges to a barely stagnant 0.3%. Expected inflation, which was supposed to hover right around the 2% target, is now projected to more than double. But perhaps the most staggering figure here comes from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. They calculate that this conflict could wipe out roughly £28.5 billion in economic output over 2 years. To put that into perspective, that's money meant for infrastructure, schools, and hospitals that effectively vanishes, all due to a geopolitical conflict the UK didn't even start.
Which brings us to the ultimate question as we wrap up this explainer. We know the UK economy showed immense resilience and adaptation in Q2. British businesses and workers absolutely proved they can deliver growth under pressure. But as millions of families brace for another long winter of eye-watering energy bills and tightening budgets, we have to ask, will this crisis in the Strait of Hormuz just be a temporary blip the economy can quickly absorb, or are we looking at a completely lost year for the UK economy? It's a fascinating, complex situation, and I highly encourage you to keep a close eye on how these numbers develop in the months ahead. Thank you so much for joining me today.